All right, so we need to spend a little bit more time on anaerobic respiration, and because I didn't really go into too much detail about that before. So here's the target, or what you should be able to do, this or that, to distinguish between the types of anaerobic respiration. So I think that actually before we jump into this, I want to review um, a little bit about respiration, just so that we have some context. So before we come to this, before we come to this, we're going to compare to aerobic respiration. So remember that aerobic and anaerobic are opposite. So aerobic involves oxygen. Well, if we remember that the full equation of aerobic respiration is glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, and it gives us CO2 plus water plus ATP, and really it's 36 or 38 molecules of ATP. That's quite a lot of ATP, which is really cool. And then the other thing is that this breaks down into 3 steps. So aerobic cellular respiration has 3 components. The first is called glycolysis. The second is Krebs cycle. And the third is the electron transport chain. So remember that these are our inputs. Let me see if I can. So I'm going to underline the inputs in yellow, and then the outputs in orange. And the inputs are also known as reactants, or the things that go into a reaction, and the things underlined in orange are the products, or the things that were produced. Oops, the products, the things that were produced by the reaction. So, that being said, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in glycolysis. So, the input, I'll do this in the same color, is C6H12O6, the glucose, and the glucose gets broken down into 2 pyruvates. Now, or pyruvic acid, sometimes it was called. Now notice that there's no reactant. Actually, you know what? I apologize. Let me do this and let me erase this and write this in orange, because the pyruvate is one of the products, right? So, of this particular reaction. And if there's 6 carbons in glucose, then we know that each one of these has 3 carbons in it, which is key, and we'll come back to that. But notice that glucose is our only input here. There's no oxygen. So sometimes glycolysis can be referred to as anaerobic. So this part of it is actually officially and technically anaerobic, but it is a requirement of aerobic cellular respiration. And the real reason is that there are a couple other products that come off of this. We've got 2 ATP molecules, and we've got some NADH molecules, which are really carrying the hydrogens from the glucose there. And some of the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens are traveling with each of the pyruvates into the Krebs cycle. But what they actually do on their way to the Krebs cycle is give off carbon dioxide as one of our products. So let's just remember, we got glucose as an input, carbon dioxide is one of our products here. So we give off some of that. So we give off 1 carbon of the 3 for each of the pyruvates. So really what we have going into the Krebs cycle is a I guess I'll just give you this extra detail. I won't expect you to know this, but this is something that IB kids are responsible for knowing. It's called acetyl CoA. And that acetyl CoA, if you can figure it out, is a 2-carbon molecule, and it goes through this cycle, which I'm not going into a lot of detail about, but it gives off some CO2s, and it comes back around. It cycles over and over and over again, giving off some CO2s, and let's do that. I apologize. It's been a long day. I'm not focusing on the color coding. So CO2 is a product. So it comes off, and the other product that comes off, we have a couple more. We have a few more ATP, and we've got some NADHs and some FADH2s. And again, these are carrying the hydrogens and electrons or energy. But that's the key, is in that these guys will go into the electron transport chain and combine with oxygen, and they go through a series of reactions across the inner mitochondrial membrane, and out come lots of ATP and water. So we've accounted for oxygen as a reactant, glucose as a reactant. We've got carbon dioxide, water, and ATP as products. But what happens to the NADHs and the FADH2s? Well, they come out after giving up their hydrogens here to water as NAD plus and FADH plus. Well, they've got to go somewhere as well. If you can infer, we don't put that as at the end of the reaction, so that implies that they get used up. Well, they go back to the cycle. So NADs will go back to be one of the reactants of glycolysis, so I should amend that glucose is the only reactant. Really, NAD plus is one of the reactants, and FADH and NAD plus go back into the Krebs cycle. Some of the NAD pluses do. And they get reused there to carry those hydrogens over to the electron transport chain. And the goal is to make lots and lots of ATP, because this is the form of energy that our bodies can use. So this is very complicated, and I want you to see that, in order to make lots and lots of ATP, we need oxygen, and we need the products that come off of the Krebs cycle and glycolysis. But this does not always happen, and so that's what we're talking about here with anaerobic respiration. We're talking about without oxygen. So this equation doesn't actually work anymore, and we need a different model, a different formula, and that's what we're going to write over here. So we're talking about anaerobic respiration. Let me just write that again. And again, that means without oxygen. And we'll talk about what happens in humans first. In humans. So this is anaerobic respiration, so we start with, I'll use the same colors that I used before. We start with glucose as a reactant, but we don't have any oxygen. So glucose is the only reactant, the net reactant, and what that implies is that even without oxygen, remember that that glycolysis still happens. So our glucose still gets broken into two pyruvates. But these pyruvates actually can't go into Krebs cycle. Now remember, Krebs doesn't use oxygen. Remember, there's no oxygen here being used by the Krebs cycle, but it does need something. It needs a lot of NAD plus and FADH pluses that it can only get as a result of, as a product from the electron transfer chain, which does use oxygen. So it can work for a little while, but it's going to run out of NAD pluses and FADH pluses for the Krebs cycle. So it can only go so far. So really, this reaction is not going to go into the Krebs cycle, and it's going to stall. So what's actually going to happen is that this pyruvate will go through, let me pick a different color here. It will, instead of going through Krebs, instead of the Krebs cycle, the pyruvate goes through lactic acid fermentation. And this is one of the types of anaerobic respiration. And you should know it happens in humans. So, this pyruvate, which remember is a 3-carbon molecule, gets converted into lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid. And in doing so, lactic acid is also a 3-carbon molecule. But when it goes through this process, it actually gives off 2 molecules of ATP. So we get a little bit of energy, but then it pauses, it freezes, and this molecule can't be used in Krebs to continue forward, and glycolysis can only happen so quickly. So there's a problem here, and this lactic acid actually causes a little bit of a burn in your muscles. It causes you to stop your physical activity, catch your breath. And what happens is that when that lactic acid, when your body picks up on the amount of oxygen, increases the amount of oxygen in it, it kicks this lactic acid back into pyruvate, so that the pyruvate now, in the presence of oxygen, can go through Krebs and then the electron transport chain. So this is, the lactic acid is kind of like a reserve form of energy, but in order to go back, it has to use energy, even though it made energy. So it gave off energy to go in this direction, but uses energy to go back into pyruvate. So it's not really a good way to make a lot of energy. So I'm going to erase that, and we'll talk about what happens in yeast. Because a very different process happens in yeast. It's not lactic acid fermentation. I'm going to erase this as well. Okay, so in yeast, the same reaction happens, glycolysis happens, but this pyruvate doesn't get converted into lactic acid. Instead, it goes into alcohol fermentation. And that alcohol fermentation, so this is the other type of fermentation. This alcohol that's actually made is called, the chemical name of it is ethanol, which means there are 2 carbons. So we went from 3 carbons to 2 carbons, which implies that we gave off, or when I say the yeast gave off carbon dioxide into the air. So if it's lost carbon dioxide, we should know that going back is not a possibility. You can't add a carbon back if you lost it to the atmosphere. So this 2-carbon ethanol can't be converted back into pyruvate, and therefore it does not go through Krebs nor the electron transport chain. So that doesn't happen. But here, this is what this 2-carbon ethanol is what is produced through this alcohol fermentation. So really, what you need to make alcohol, this ethanol, is a sugar, a glucose-like glucose or glucose-like molecule, and yeast in the absence of oxygen. All right, and those are the two types of anaerobic respiration. You should be able to tell me that story and compare that to aerobic cellular respiration. And I know that's a lot of information. It's almost like it's a whole unit on its own. So make sure that you spend sufficient time practicing this explanation and that you understand these concepts.